Hey everybody, Brad Halleck from BH Cosplay. I wanted to make a quick video on how to make a jacket mold. So I hope you enjoy it, and if you like it, hit like and subscribe. What I'm using to build this mold is a material called Sgt Art Plastilina Clay. You can buy it in the 5-pound blocks. It's only about 13 bucks on Amazon. I bought a couple of those so that I'd have plenty to work with. The cool thing about this stuff is it's mineral based, so it won't harden and it's totally reusable. So you can just wad it all up, throw it in a bucket. It'll sit around for months at a time, pull it back out, and it's just like it was when you put it away. Before you start building your border, you want to make sure that the prop you're molding is level on your workspace. So what I have done is I've taken this pistol that I'm molding and I placed some plastilina clay underneath it and pushed it down into it so that I could level the prop. The reason you want to do that is because when you're building your frame around it, you're basically dividing the prop in half. So you're going to be molding two different sides of this prop. And so you want to basically create a dividing line all the way around the prop. I've also placed my prop on a piece of plywood and then placed that piece of plywood on what's called a lazy Susan. It's basically a disc that can spin 360 degrees, so it allows me to spin my prop very easily so I can work on it from all sides without having to pick up the piece of wood and slide it or move it. It makes things a lot easier when you're doing something all the way around a prop. I'm using several different types of tools while I'm working with the clay, and most of these tools you can purchase at any hobby shop or Amazon. They're a combination of metal head and silicone head tools that allow me to smooth and shape the clay so that I can get it exactly the way I want it while I'm building this mold. You want to make sure that the clay is pushed up tight against the mold so that you don't have any gaps or air spaces that would allow the silicone to leak through when you're pouring your mold. Once you get your clay flat and exactly the way you want it for the half, you're then going to want to put in what are called registration keys. What registration keys are is essentially little divots in the clay that allow the two molds to more easily match up when you put them together. You want to try to get the registration keys as close to the model itself because that's what helps the two halves of the silicone mold marry up so you don't get any shifting of the molds when you put them back together. Once your registration keys are inserted, what I do is I build a border using more plastilina clay to help keep the silicone in place when I pour my first layer. I usually make this border about a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch taller than the base layer of clay. This allows the first layer of silicone to hold in place, and it also allows me to pour in a thinner version of the silicone so that it makes sure to get into all the small nooks and crannies so I don't lose any detail. The first thing I want to do is put in a mold release. There are several different products out there. The one I'm using here is essentially talcum powder. Now that my mold release is on, I'm going to mix and pour my first layer of Rebound 25 silicone, which is a platinum cure silicone. For the first layer of silicone, I add a silicone thinner to the mixture of Rebound 25. Rebound 25 is inherently a thicker silicone. It's specifically designed to be spread onto a surface and generally hold that surface. So by thinning out the first layer, it allows the silicone to flow more smoothly and get down into those nooks and crannies so I don't lose any detail. If you're not quite sure how much silicone to use, you can always start small and add layers as you go. I always add enough silicone in my first batch so that I can create registration keys that I will need later on in the process. Once the first layer of Rebound 25 has cured, I'm going to start mixing my second layer of Rebound 25. This layer I want to be much thicker so that I use less product. I thicken Rebound 25 by adding Thi-Vex. You only need to use a little bit. I then apply it to the mold in all the high points where the first layer of silicone didn't fully cover. I take my pre-made registration keys and set them in the thicker silicone. Without mold release, silicone will stick to silicone. Once the silicone is fully cured, I remove the clay border only from the mold before I start applying the Plasti-Paste. In the same way as mixing the silicone, always start with a smaller amount rather than a larger amount. You can always build up the layers of Plasti-Paste, so if you didn't mix enough for the first full coverage, that's no problem. You can always go back and add more layers. It's much better than mixing up too much and having excess and waste. It's important to remember that it's easier to deal with it when it's wet and make it smooth than it is to try to deal with it once it's dry. Once the Plasti-Paste shell has cured, I flip over the mold and remove all of the Sgt Art Plastilina Clay. Be very careful as you're removing the clay that you don't disturb the mold itself. You don't want your prop to move around inside the silicone, and you definitely don't want to remove it. Once the mold is all cleaned up and the prop is cleaned up, it's now time to add the edge barrier for the silicone pour. I wanted to try a couple of different techniques to see what would work best. I started out trying to build another clay barrier, but that didn't work. The clay wouldn't stick and I couldn't get a clean connection between the clay and the silicone. The second method I tried was using duct tape to surround the mold. Unfortunately, it didn't work. The next method I tried was using poster board to create a border around the mold. I cut the paper out so that it would stick up about a ½ inch above the silicone itself. I then used my 3-2-1 blocks to hold the paper against the mold and used hot glue to create a seal between the paper and the silicone. The poster board and hot glue method worked the best, and it gave me a great seal between the border and the silicone, so that's the method I'm using from now on. Before you pour your next layer of silicone, this step is of paramount importance. You have to spray your mold with universal mold release or some type of mold release. If you don't, the silicone will stick to itself and you will never get this prop out of the silicone without cutting it out. At this point, you're just going to follow the exact same steps as before. You're going to start out with a thinner layer of Rebound 25. Once that cures, you're going to add a thicker layer of Rebound 25, and then you will insert your registration keys. Generally speaking, I will always mix up a little bit extra Rebound 25 when I'm doing my thin layer so I can create a few more registration keys. If you have a bunch of registration keys pre-made, it's a great way to not have to worry about it and to help speed up the process of your mold making. Once my silicone is cured, it's now on to the next step, doing the Plasti-Paste jacket. Again, just like I did earlier in the video, I'm going to put a nice thick coating over the mold, making sure that it covers my registration keys and is uniformly covered over the mold itself. If you notice that once it's cured, it appears to be thin in one spot or another, you can always go back and add some more Plasti-Paste to the jacket to give it more strength. You'll notice I'm using a scale to measure out my product. Most of these smooth-on products can be measured by volume, but I have found that my eye isn't very good at getting the volumes exactly right. That creates an issue when I get down to the last part of what's left, and I end up having a little bit more than the other one, which ends up wasting material. It's now for the moment of truth. Time to open your mold. Once the mold is separated, I remove the prop and inspect the silicone mold. The next step is creating a pouring channel. I decided with this prop I wanted the pouring channel to be at the barrel. I marked the location for the pour spout on the silicone and the Plasti-Paste jacket with a pen and used an X-Acto knife to cut it out in the silicone and my Dremel tool to cut it out in the Plasti-Paste. I'll use a very sharp X-Acto knife and a pair of forceps to grab those little pieces and cut them off. I sprayed the inside of the halves of the silicone mold with mold release and then fit the two halves together. Just like with the silicone border, I wanted to try a few different methods to see what was the best way to clamp this mold together for pouring resin. I tried different types of clamps at first. The clamps wouldn't hold and continued to slip off. I ended up using Bungie cords. I wrapped them around the mold itself, making sure they were secure so that they held my mold and kept it from leaking. If you don't know the volume of your mold, there are a couple of ways you can figure it out. The easiest is to clamp your mold together, fill the mold with water, dump that water that's in your mold into a bucket that has measurement lines on it. That amount of water that was in your mold translates to how much resin you will need to fill it. Once I determine the volume of the mold, I write the amount of resin I need on the outside of the jacket so that it's always handy and I'll never forget. It is not uncommon for there to be some minor problems that happen when you do your first cast. For me, I ended up with some air bubbles in a couple of spots on the prop. To solve for that problem, I used a very sharp X-Acto knife and I cut in venting channels. What these venting channels allow is for any air that's in the mold to escape up in these channels and allows the resin to fill those spots much easier. I hope you enjoyed this video on creating a jacket mold. If you have any comments or questions, don't hesitate to ask them below or send me a message. Thanks for watching and keep on building.